Good morning. Welcome back to another reading of Bobby the Brave Sometimes. Today we have chapters 13 and 14. We are getting close to the end. There are 19 chapters, so we should be done with this book by the end of next week. Just a heads up, on Wednesday, report cards are due, so I will be writing report cards this week. Grades will be coming from things that we did in class before coronavirus, and then you'll have another separate grade for whether or not you've been participating in our online lessons. So you'll see sections for 2 grades. Grades for what we did in class before this happened, and then things that you've been doing now that you're working online. All right, chapter 13. Casey whacked her brother over the head. The title is A Regular Person. Casey whacked her brother over the head with Wandy 2, her new wand. Bobby, wake up! Bobby groaned and buried himself deeper under his covers. Was it Wednesday already? Mr. Reinerhouse had probably recovered from his food poisoning, and that meant there would be PE today. Maybe it would be best just to stay in bed and avoid Wednesday altogether. After a while, it grew quiet. Good, Bobby thought. Casey left. It was getting stuffy under the covers, but when he came up for air, splash! Casey! Bobby yelled. Why did you do that? Do what? Casey smiled sweetly as she tried to hide an empty water glass behind her back. Mommy told me to wake you up. Now get up, Bobby, Bobby, Bobby! Hey, sleepyhead, Mr. Ellis Chan said when Bobby finally made it downstairs for breakfast. Since when did you start taking showers in the morning? I didn't take a shower, Bobby growled. It was raining in my room. Casey giggled. I've got some cream of wheat waffles for you right here, his father said, placing a plate of charred blobs in front of him. Bobby glanced at Annie, who was shaking her head, mouthing, She was wearing her football helmet and a jersey. He used to wonder why she wore it every day. Now Bobby realized why. If he could play football as well as Annie, he'd do the same thing so everyone would know that he was important. At our last football game, the entire Ellis Chan family sat on the bleachers and cheered as Bobby's big sister completed pass after pass. Eat up, Annie, her father said, refilling her glass with milk. You want to bulk up for your big game on Friday. When the other team sees you out there passing the ball, they'll wish they never heard of Rancho Rosetta High School Tigers. On the walk to school, Bobby was unusually quiet. What are you thinking about? Holly asked. She offered him half of her toasty oatsy cereal bar. Nothing, he said as he munched. Worried about Mr. Reinerhouse? Yeah, Bobby admitted. Is your dad coming to school? I didn't even tell him about Mr. Reinerhouse, Bobby said. He'd probably get all upset to learn we're playing football during PE. My dad knows what a loser I am. They silently picked up their pace when they passed the house where the scary cat lived. Cobwebs crowded the windows and the creaky wooden gate was falling apart. Paint peeled off the sides of the house. It seemed ready for Halloween, except that it always looked like that. I can't imagine your dad calling you a loser, Holly said once they cleared the Halloween house. He doesn't have to say it, Bobby replied glumly. I just know it. For once, Bobby wished the clock would slow down. He was dreading PE more than he ever dreaded anything in his life. During silent study, Bobby made up a list of things he would rather do than face Mr. Reinerhouse. Go to the dentist, eat a bug, be friends with Julian Czar, get a mohawk. Then he crossed out number 3, be friends with Julian Czar, and replaced it with clean the attic. When the dreaded hour for PE finally arrived, Mr. Reinerhouse beamed at him with such intensity that Bobby was momentarily blinded. Bobby Ellis Chan, come up front with me, his teacher instructed. Reluctantly, Bobby did as he was told. Is your father coming today? Not today, Bobby answered. His throat was dry. Well, maybe another day. Mr. Einerhouse said, trying not to look disappointed. He faced the class. Today we start football, and I'm honored that Bobby has agreed to be my assistant. Bobby shook his head. He hadn't agreed to help. Some of the girls snickered. First, we'll break into 4 teams. Bobby, it seems only right that you be a team captain. Volunteers for the other captains? As usual, Jillian Czar, Jackson, and St. James raised their hands. All righty, let's begin. Bobby, you pick first, Mr. Reinerhouse instructed. Bobby had never been a team captain before. Some kids looked directly at him. Others waved. A few jumped up and down. Chess held his hands up as if he was pleading and gave Bobby the same wide-eyed look Wilbur used when he wanted another dog biscuit. Chess, Bobby said. Chess grinned so wide that it took up half his face. As he stepped behind Bobby, he whispered, Thank you, thank you, thank you. As Bobby expected, Jillian, Jackson, and St. James picked the most athletic kids. When it was Bobby's turn to pick again, he called out, Holly Harper. A murmur ran through the class. A girl had never been on a team with the boys before. But the way Bobby figured it, since there were 3 boy team captains and 1 girl team captain, some girls would have to be with the boys anyway. Holly high-fived with Chess as she took her place behind Bobby. When the last person was called, Bobby's team included Chess, Holly, Susie, Amy, and Amelia, 2 girls Bobby had always had trouble telling apart, and Kip, a boy who was semi-famous because in 2nd grade he had broken both wrists in a freak bowling accident. Once the teams were decided, Mr. Reinerhouse tossed footballs to each team captain. Bobby caught his and looked around to see if anyone had noticed. Let's begin with the basics, Mr. Reinerhouse shouted. Everyone took turns holding the ball. At least Bobby knew how to do that. When it came to throw, Jillian Czar's ball spiraled way past the tetherball courts. St. James and Jackson were pretty good at throwing, too. Susie's ball had somehow went straight up, and Chess's ball hit Holly in the knee. Then it was Bobby's turn. Okay, everyone, gather around, Mr. Reinerhouse said. I want you all to see this. Bobby felt his chest tighten. Was he having a heart attack? What if he collapsed right now? He felt like throwing up. That was sure pass out of PE. Maybe if he had a heart attack, threw up, and broke both his wrists, he could get out of PE for the rest of the year. Mr. Reinerhouse handed Bobby a football. Show these kids how to throw. I'll go long and you pass it to me. Bobby watched in silent panic as Mr. Reinerhouse jogged to the far side of the playground. He looked like a speck. Bobby realized that if he turned around and ran home right now, Mr. Reinerhouse would have a hard time catching up to him. Any time now, Mr. Reinerhouse shouted. I'm ready. Bobby motioned for Mr. Reinerhouse to come closer, then closer still until he was about 5 feet from him. Bobby tossed him the ball. What was that? Jillian Czar asked. Are you playing hot potato? Mr. Reinerhouse shook his head. I'm disappointed, he said. Even though Bobby was standing still, his heart was racing. He was glad his father wasn't here to see this. Bobby, it was unfair of me to ask you to show off in front of everyone, he heard Mr. Reinerhouse say. We all know that if you're 1/10 of the athlete your father is, you could make that ball sail over the school into the street. Yet you chose not to show off. That's a sign of a true gentleman. St. James started to say something, but then stopped when Holly pinched him. Bobby didn't think it was possible, but now he felt even worse. Mr. Reinerhouse had gotten it all wrong. He wasn't 1/10 of an athlete his dad was. He wasn't even 1/100th. The class dragged on. Bobby's team was as bad as he thought they'd be. At one point, both Chess and Bobby fell down when they ran into each other. And when Holly scored a touchdown for the opposing team, she looked like she was going to cry. By the time the class was over, Bobby was ready to hide under a rock. But Mr. Reinerhouse had other plans. Bobby, he said, stay behind and help me. In silence, Bobby and Mr. Reinerhouse returned the football equipment to the PE shed. Finally, Bobby spoke up. Mr. Reinerhouse, I'm sorry I'm so lousy at football. I can't even throw. Mr. Reinerhouse smiled at Bobby. He didn't look nearly as scary when he smiled. You can throw, he said. Well, okay, so maybe when you throw, your ball doesn't go as far as you'd like, or even in the right direction, but you can throw. In fact, I was quite impressed when you threw the ball and it spiraled behind you. I've never seen that before. Listen, Bobby, if you just practice, you can get a lot better. I'm sure your dad can help you get really good at football. But what if I don't want to play football? Bobby blurted out angrily. Do I have to just because my dad did? He covered his mouth. Bobby had never said that out loud before. You have a good point, Mr. Reinerhouse said slowly. He sat down on the bench and motioned for Bobby to sit too. My father wanted me to be a doctor like him. I even started to study medicine until I realized that being a doctor wasn't who I was meant to be. Bobby nodded. Mr. Reinerhouse knew how he felt. I'm sorry I put you on the spot, his teacher continued. I was so thrilled to learn who your father is that I mistook you for him. Hearing this made Bobby laugh. No one had ever mistaken him for the Fraser before. Thanks, Mr. Reinerhouse, Bobby said. That's a first. As Mr. Reinerhouse walked him back to room 15, Bobby thought that maybe Mr. Reinerhouse wasn't so awful once he got to know him. In fact, he no longer seemed like a mean PE teacher. Instead, Mr. Reinerhouse almost seemed like a regular person. Chapter 14. Dress Rehearsal. And bring your costumes tomorrow, Mrs. Carlson reminded the class. We'll be having our one and only dress rehearsal. St. James hoisted his backpack over his shoulder. You should see my Daddy Warbucks costume, he bragged. It's got shoulder pads and everything. I look so good. Bobby zipped his Troy Eagle backpack shut. His father had been working on his costume forever, but he refused to let anyone see it. Bobby wasn't sure what to expect, especially since his dad had never sewn anything before, unless you counted an upside-down patch on Annie's Leatherman jacket. That afternoon, when Bobby got home, Casey and Wormy Worm greeted him. You should be more careful, Bobby advised his sister as she dangled her worm in his face. I'm not sure Wormy likes that. Oh. Casey gently kissed her worm, then placed him back in a dirt patch. Bobby, want to play, please? Bobby had homework, plus he needed to check on his Sandy costume. But when he looked at Casey, who had her eyes screwed shut and her fingers crossed, he said, Okay, but just for a half an hour. I have important things to do. Well, I have important things to do when I'm big like you, Bobby? Casey asked as she followed him into the house. He nodded. Sure, in fact, you already do a lot of important things. Casey's jaw dropped. I do? Like what? Tell me. Well, you take good care of Wormy Worm, Bobby said. Casey nodded. And you always make sure your crown is on straight. Casey touched her crown. Princess Becky says that a true princess always wears her crown with pride. What else, Bobby? What other important things do I do? He gave it some thought. Well, Mom always asks you to wake me up in the morning so I'm not late to school, and if you didn't do that and I was late every day, then I might get kicked out of 4th grade. And if that happened, I couldn't get into 5th grade or any other grade, and I might end up a ne'er-do-well. Bobby, his little sister asked, what's a ne'er-do-well? I'm not sure, he answered. I heard it on the Hop Along Howdy Cowboy show, and I don't think it's a good thing. Casey's eyes welled up with tears. I don't want you to become a ne'er-do-well, she sobbed, flinging her arms around him. I promised to keep up with my important things. Wow, if it weren't for me, you'd be a ne'er-do-well? Wait until I tell Dada do. As Casey raced to her room to talk to her stuffed dragon, Bobby couldn't help but smile. He liked being a big brother. Mr. Ellis Chan had left Bobby's afternoon snack on the kitchen table. Today, it was a chunk of cheddar cheese, some green grapes, and what looked like either a cookie or maybe mashed potatoes, or, knowing his father, a combination of both. How was school? His dad's voice said behind him. Bobby startled. He had just buried the cookie potato thing in the trash and hoped his father didn't see him. Pretty good, Bobby said. We need to bring our costumes tomorrow for the dress rehearsal. Worry washed over Mr. Ellis Chan's face. Oh, was all he said. How about we go to the fabric store? There was a little accident. Well, not an accident, but, well, we need some more fabric. Will it be done in time? Bobby asked. It would be embarrassing to be the only kid without a costume. Well, it won't be ready by tomorrow, but I promise it'll be done in time for the show. Casey was happy to be back at So What. She took dozens of spools of thread from the shelves and then stacked them in towers on the floor. Bobby helped her put them back as the store lady stood over them and glared. And make sure the colors are in the correct places, she snapped. Once that was finished, Casey tagged along as Bobby went in search of the furry fabric. Here it is, Bobby called out to his father once he found it. Achoo! Excuse me. Bobby sneezed all the way to the cash register as he carried the fake fur. The grumpy store lady frowned when she saw him and Casey, but then gasped when she recognized who was with them. The freezer! She exclaimed as she tilted her head back and looked up. Wow, wait a moment. She dialed the phone and handed it to Mr. Ellis Chan. If you could just growl to my husband, he'll be thrilled. We're both big fans. Oh, and these must be your darling children. Don't they look sweet? Here, kids, have a lollipop. Have two. At the dress rehearsal, Holly's hair and costume were all old-fashioned and just as one would expect of Miss Hannigan. St. James stood taller wearing his Daddy Warbucks suit, and Susie made the perfect little orphan Annie and even wore a red wig. Everyone looked like they just stepped off a Broadway stage. Except, of course, for Bobby. Instead of a Sandy costume, he was wearing his usual skater shorts and a Troy Eagle t-shirt. My father says to tell you that my costume will be done in time, Bobby mumbled to Mrs. Carlson. He kept his eyes on the ground as he spoke. As the rehearsal progressed, Bobby got swept up in the show and forgot he wasn't dressed as a dog. His barking had never been better. He even added some yelps and a long, inspired howl that made everyone laugh. Was this how his dad felt when he scored a touchdown? He wondered. His sister Annie might be a good quarterback, but could she be half the mutt Bobby was? He couldn't wait for the show and imagined his father proudly telling the other parents, "See that dog? That's my boy." And here is the picture. Okay, so today's assignment is going to be in a Google slide. So you're going to have to edit the text boxes and type your answers in there. And then to submit it to me, I posted a video on Dojo, but I'll also post that video on here in case your parents didn't show you that other video. Because there's a different way to submit things from a Google slide than like the regular quiz type thing that I've been doing. So to make sure that I actually get to see your work once you're done, you need to be sure that you're following the correct steps. So you'll see the slides and you'll just edit the slides. I'll put directions on each page, and then when you're done, go back and you have to hit turn in on the assignment page. Okay? Bye.